I am thrilled to be here. What a tremendous place. And you are blessed. And I thank God for Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk and Lauren. And she's the faith representative here. And Sam and Charnessa and Pastor Chuck and just the whole team. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get into my presentation. So I have a PowerPoint where I go through all the world's history and show that the most common form of government is a king. And so when I had an idea years ago, and I thought I would research every single century of recorded human history. And so I went back to the beginning of the invention of writing at Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley. Today that's Iraq. And so the first story of a government is what? Nimrod, Tower of Babel. And the Jewish commentator Josephus said Nimrod wanted to build the tower so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. And then he made everyone bake bricks and bring them, or he would kill them. So it was defiant against God, oppressive over man. God comes down, confuses the languages, and the people scatter. And it's almost like every generation since has tried to rebuild the Tower of Babel. And each time it comes around, it's a little bit worse, because with military advancements, kings can kill more people. So instead of Cain killing Abel with a rock, they can kill with bronze weapons, iron weapons, phalanx spears the Greeks had, scimitar swords the Muslims had, gunpowder the Chinese invented, the scimitar sword, the stirrup. I mean, there's always, and each time it makes it so the kings can kill more people. And until finally the King of England was the biggest. And are you working on the PowerPoint? Okay, so I wanted to make sure it wasn't me that was not pressing the right button. So it's quite a fascinating study. So every single century, you have, all the different Egyptian dynasties, and then the Neo-Egyptian dynasties, and then Assyria, Neo-Assyria, and then you have, the Gilgamesh, king of Uruk. The first story ever written in any language is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written about 1,000 years before Moses wrote the Old Testament. And the story of Gilgamesh is he was the king of Uruk, or Iraq, and he was the first one to build a wall around a city. Somebody had to come up with that idea. And then he goes on this long journey to meet this old guy who survived the global flood. Calls it a global flood. And this old guy, he calls him Uptanapsharin, something like that. He had built a boat, covered it with tar and pitch, filled it full of animals. The world flooded, called it a global flood, and afterwards it settled on a mountain, and they got out and repopulated the world. It's like, it's a story of Noah. Right? But here's Gilgamesh, right? So this was over 100 ancient civilizations have flood stories in their ancient past. Right? I mean, it's pretty evident that it happened. But you see, themes repeat themselves. People say history repeats itself. Really, human nature repeats itself. All right? I used to say you could go to any high school and you would find the kids going to the same groups. Right? The gossip girls and the nerds and the jocks and the geeks, whatever the names are. But it's like every school has the same groups. It's like, why is that? And the same way with governments, right? So you go anywhere around the world, you got those that are lusting for power, those that are kissing up to those that are lusting for power, those that are suffering under the power, those that said, I had enough, and they leave, right? But then they end up restarting the whole thing, and then they start getting into power. The first invention was the plow. Cain was a tiller of the soil. And then people started hitting each other with them, and they turned into weapons. And then people started gravitating together for protection because of this random violence, and they would come together. And whenever you get people together, somebody's a little better at knowing how to fight than the rest. And everyone says, hey, you be our captain. And you fight, you win, that's a good thing. But then this captain has kids and grandkids, and everybody wants to be friends with this family. And before you know it, it goes from honoring them to sort of kissing up to them, and they become the political machine family. And if you want to get anywhere in town, you got to be their friend. And if you're not their friend, you're kicked out of town. And so it turns into a king. And so it just repeats itself. I mean, think of it. If there were no police tomorrow, what would happen? Well, it'd be okay for a couple days, and then people would start robbing the stores. When word gets out, they'd rob all the stores. And when all the stores are empty, what are they going to do? They're going to start going neighborhood to neighborhood, house to house. And so what are we going to do? We're going to organize ourselves to protect our neighborhood. And we're going to find that somebody knows how to fight better than the rest. Say, hey, you be our captain. But then the other neighborhood will have their captain, right? And before you know it, you're going to get back to kings. That's sort of the norm. And so we got it there. Yeah, there we go. And thank you. Let's give him a hand. I think God does that to keep me humble. One time I was like at a church. It was a big church, and they had my laptop all set up, and they introduced me, and I come up there, and I forgot to plug the laptop in. The battery was dead. And so I'm like trying to reboot the thing while I'm talking. And anyway. So there's my website, AmericanMinute.com. And I wanted to start off with this thought, because the left is saying, well, nationalism, Christian nationalists. You ever heard that? They try to malign that. And it's a real thing. I mean, the government lists all the potential terrorists, and at the top of the list are like Christian nationalists and traditional Catholics, pro-life people. And it's like, oh. And so I point out how even George Washington said, to the distinguished character of patriot, it should be our highest glory to laud the more distinguished character of Christian. So for most of world history, it was called Christian patriotism. They did not use the word nationalism. That's sort of a new thing. And even here's Newsweek magazine, God Bless America. In 1965, 93% of Americans were Christian. 69% Protestant, 24% Catholic, and then there were 3% Jewish. That's a huge percentage. You even had Democrat President Franklin Roosevelt giving out New Testaments and Book of Psalms to all the soldiers in World War II. I mean, that would be pretty right-wing today. They would say, oh, you got to put, Bhagavad Gita and the Quran and everything else, and the Satanism book, who knows? But this was a Democrat president passing out Gideon's New Testaments and Book of Psalms, and he wrote the foreword to it. All right? It says, as Commander-in-Chief, I take pleasure in commending the reading of the Bible to all who serve in the armed forces. So when they want to say, well, you Christians are right-wing fanatics, like, you're calling FDR a right-wing fanatic. So I wrote a whole book on FDR. That's the cover of my book there. And he said, the whole world is divided between pagan brutality and the Christian ideal. We choose human freedom, which is the Christian ideal. And then FDR said in 1942, this great war effort shall not be imperiled by a handful of noisy traitors, betrayers of America, betrayers of Christianity itself. And then he says, we guard against the forces of anti-Christian aggression. And then November 1st, 1940, those forces hate democracy and Christianity as two phases of the same civilization. They oppose democracy because it is Christian. They oppose Christianity because it preaches democracy. Preservation of these rights is vitally important to the whole future of Christian civilization. Remember, like Winston Churchill says, the fate of Christian civilization depends on this is our finest hour speech. So the left wants to replace the word Christian civilization and Christian patriotism with Christian nationalism. It's a new thing that we've never used that word before. It's always been Christian civilization, Christian patriotism. Now, why do they want to use the word nationalism? Because nationalism means different things in different nations. Depends what nation you're in, right? And so in America, we want to preserve a nation where you have freedom, where you are in charge. Government from the consent of the governed, where you have rights that the government can't take away. So we want to preserve a nation that guarantees freedom. But in other countries, nationalism is, they want to preserve a socialist government where you don't have any rights. And so FDR says, patriots of 1776 had broken away from indentured servitude. The source of their greatness was a new sense of freedom, self-government, freedom of conscience. So we want to preserve our nationalism, Christian nationalism, if they want to use that word. It's to preserve a country where it's self-government and freedom of conscience. Reagan said, in this country of ours took place the greatest revolution that has ever taken place in the world's history. And he says, the founding fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves, the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. So this is the nation we want to preserve. But in other countries, nationalism is used to describe totalitarian socialist regimes where the state determines everyone's destiny. And so the left is actually the one that wants to institute nationalism. They want to institute a woke nationalism, where they deny freedom of conscience, and deny freedom of speech, and deny human rights, and kill innocent babies, and call some races evil, and cancel political opponents. And they do something called psychological projection, where they blame you for what they're guilty of. Right. It's in the Bible. Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of lusting after her when she was lusting after him. Right? This is a cheating spouse will accuse the faithful spouse of being unfaithful. I mean, it's a projection. And little kids do it. I didn't start the fight, you did. And anyway. And the Pharisees incited a riot in the Capitol, but they blamed Paul for it. And Paul's at the trial. Tertullus began to accuse Paul, saying, we have found this man a pestilent fellow, a mover of sedition among the Jews, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, who's gone about to profane the temple. And Paul answered, they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither raising up the people, neither in the synagogues, nor in the city, neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. So they stirred up the insurrection at the Capitol, but they wanted to blame Paul for stirring it up. I mean, even Nero did this. Nero set fire to Rome and blamed the innocent Christians. Right? So you do an insurrection at the Capitol and you blame the innocent people. And they did it to Jesus. They had the audacity to accuse Jesus of being demon-possessed when they're the ones whose father was the devil. And Adam did this to God. He blame-shifted. Right? Adam sinned. But he says, the woman you gave me, it's your fault. Adam blamed God. So this idea. So it's gotten into politics. David Axelrod was the campaign advisor for a previous president. And on NPR radio, April 19, 2010, he said, in Chicago, there was an old tradition of throwing a brick through your own campaign office window and then calling a press conference to say you've been attacked, right? And accusing your opponent of throwing the brick. So they do the crime, they accuse you of doing the exact, so they want to get on television and call you hateful when they're hateful. They want to call you intolerant when they're intolerant. They want to call you a bigot and a chauvinist and you know, everything bad. But they're the ones that are the bad ones. And so today, nationalism is the opposite of globalism. So the globalists that want a one-world government hate the people that want to maintain national governments. And so they want to make anybody that wants to preserve a nation as bad. They want to project, they want to blame you of the bad stuff when they're doing the bad stuff. So here's Klaus Schwab. By 2030, you'll own nothing and be happy. Okay, if I don't own anything, who owns it? The government? Well, that's the definition of socialism. And I found this article in Imprimis. Michael Rechtenwald, he says, Klaus Schwab and Thierry Malleret write that if the past 5 centuries in Europe and America have taught us anything, it is that acute crises contribute to boosting the power of the state. So the Great Reset is a planned acute crisis. And they want to have food shortages and financial collapse and all kinds of fearful pandemic type stuff. Why? Because in crises, people will panic and give up their freedoms and trade their freedom for security. I got that in one of my talks coming up that I'm going to give later tonight or tomorrow. So here's Henry Minkin. He says, the urge to save humanity is almost always only a false face for the urge to rule it. So I wrote a book called Who is the King in America? And that's where I go through this, what I did before. So here's the Sumerian cuneiform. Here's the Egyptian hieroglyphics invented around 3000 BC. Here's Chinese pictogram characters around 2600 BC, the Yellow Emperor, Indian Harappan civilization. And here's a quote from astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson, Cosmos TV series. He's standing in the desert over in Iraq. He says, it was here around 5,000 years ago between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we learned how to write. So here you have a secular astrophysicist acknowledging that writing was invented around 5,000 years ago, which would be around 3,000 or so BC. Franklin Roosevelt, 5,000 years of recorded history have proven that mankind has always believed in God in spite of the many abortive attempts to exile God. So he's using the number of 5,000. Richard Overy wrote in the Times Complete History of the World, no date appears before the start of human civilizations around 5,500 years ago and the beginning of a written or pictorial history. So he's using the number of 5,500. You know, if you round it out, 6,000 years, it's not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each, back to back. How many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it? Maybe a grandmother? We're talking 60 grandmothers, and you're all the way back to the beginning of recorded human history. It's not that long ago when you look at it from that perspective. But now that we have 6,000 years of records, let's look at them. What do they show? They show there's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. Right? And so you got this Nimrod, Tower of Babel. God confuses the languages, but almost every generation since wants to rebuild it. But it keeps coming back on a bigger scale because with military advancements, kings can kill more people. And this is a screenshot of a scene from The Terminator with Arnold Schwarzenegger. I like to sort of draw analogies. And so in this movie, there's a sci-fi robot made of metal, and it's chasing them, and they blow it up, and they all sigh relief. And then out of the rubble, the metal pieces of this thing starts melting and rolling back together again and forming itself into, and it starts climbing out of the rubble, and everybody in the audience screams like, ah, how do you get rid of this thing? It's like, how do you get rid of this desire to rebuild the Tower of Babel? Every generation does it. And each time it comes around, it's worse because with military advancements, kings can kill more people. With technological advancements, kings can track more people. You know, in nature, there's something called the golden ratio, or the Fibonacci sequence, or phi, P-H-I. A number plus a previous number equals the next number, and the next number plus the previous number equals the next number. The next number, and it's a gradual rate of expansion that you observe in seashells, in tornadoes, in hurricanes, in galaxies, right? And it gets applied to other areas of academia, like finances. So when Bitcoin was first taken off, right, they were plotting it, it's going to grow at this rate, you know. And so I thought, has anybody applied it to all the kingdoms in world history? And I couldn't find it. And so that's when I started doing this study. And so you got this Nimrod, and then around 2500 BC is Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, and then 2250 BC, Sargon of Akkadian has the first empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. And then you have 2,000 years of Egyptian pharaohs, and then 5,000 years of Chinese emperors, and then king of Assyria, 700 BC, biggest empire on the planet at the time. And of course, he took the 10 northern tribes of Israel captive. But Assyria is conquered by Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, and it's conquered by Persia. And Cyrus of Persia has the biggest empire around the 5th century BC. And he's the one who lets the Jews go back and rebuild the temple. But then Persia is conquered by Alexander the Great. And around 3,300 or 330 BC, he's got the biggest empire the planet had ever seen. But he stopped from going into India. And then India has Chandragupta and the Maurya Empire. And it's the biggest empire, a quarter of the world's population. And then you have, around 25 BC, Augustus Caesar. And he has the biggest empire the planet had seen up to this point. And he had a desire to have a worldwide tracking system. It was called the census. Right? That was like new technology. Let's count everybody. If he could have had 5G and cell phones and cameras and satellites, he would have tracked people that way. But there's something about dictators that want to track everybody. And then the Ascamite Empire in Africa, and then Attila the Hun, 450 AD. He has an army of 500,000 men, wiping out cities across Europe. He's got the biggest empire. And then the Byzantine Empire, and then the 7th century AD, you have Islam comes along. Muhammad goes from being a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader and conquers from the Persian Gulf to the Atlantic Ocean at all of Spain. And then the Muslims are stopped from going into Europe by Charles Martel, and his grandson is Charlemagne, who's crowned in the year 800 AD. And he's got the biggest empire. And then the Vikings come along, year 1000, boats with low keels, can go up every river in Europe. And they would show up hundreds of miles inland. Hundreds of these boats would show up, and they'd get off, and they'd kill the men and throw these women over their shoulders, and most of them were Christian women. And they'd sail back to Norway, Sweden, and Denmark and have kids with the Christian women. But then they'd go off doing some more raiding, and these women would raise the little kids as Christians. And so within a generation or two, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark became Christian. So you ladies did a good job there, all right? And then in the 1200s, Genghis Khan conquers from Korea to Hungary, kills 30 million people. He's got the biggest empire the planet had ever seen up to this point. And then his grandson's Kublai Khan that runs China. 1300s Tamerlane, a Muslim leader, and he kills 17 million, has all of Central Asia. And then Ivan the Terrible of Russia in the 1400s. And Russia's enormous, like 12 time zones. And then you have the Western Hemisphere, and Montezuma is in charge of all of Mexico, and then Atahualpa is in charge of all of Inca Peru, and then you have the 1500s. The King of Spain has the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. The Philippines are named after his son, King Philip of Spain. 1600s, France has the biggest empire. Louis XIV, the Sun King. But then in the 1800s, the King of England had the biggest empire that planet Earth had ever seen. The King of England was a globalist. He was a one world government guy with him at the top. Right? And so anybody that can plot can see, hey, at some point this is going to max out on a global level. And Jesus says wheat and tares grow together till the harvest. So the same way you had Cain killing Abel and Nimrod forcing everybody, to break baked bricks, and then you got thousands of years of pharaohs and Caesars. At some point, it's going to max out on a global level, right? And of course, I don't know if I got the slide in here or not, but I talk about how the devil came to Jesus and offered him all the what? Kingdoms of the world. It's like, well, when did he get them? When Adam sinned. Adam was in charge of the garden. We know that because he got to name everything. Naming means you have authority over it. Adam named everything, he had authority over it. But the Bible says, to whomever you yield your members, servants to obey, to him you are a servant. The moment Adam obeyed Satan, he was posturing himself as the one taking the orders, and the devil as the one being in charge, calling the shots, right? And that's when Satan usurped the power. And anyway, so you have this lust infects human nature, this lust for power, and Cain killing Abel. St. Augustine called it libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one takes the rattle from the others. You put some kids on a playground, one's the bully hogging the ball. You put some junior high girls in a clique, and one of them is the diva. You put some natives in the woods, one of them is an Indian chief, and you put them in an inner city, one of them is a gang leader. And all a king is a glorified gang leader. It's a hierarchical system. If you are friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you are an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's called treason. Or you're a slave. Well, I thought slavery started in 1619. No, wherever you had the first king on top, you had slaves on the bottom. It's a hierarchical system that keeps repeating itself wherever you have humans. Now, what if you were the king? That'd be pretty nice. And then let's say you have a sister, gets married, has a kid. Now the kid's a teenager, and he's hanging around the wrong friend, drinking and partying, and he hits someone with the car and kills him. And now this teenager is facing mandatory prison time. And your sister comes begging to you and says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get locked away, are you? What are you going to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. Guess what? As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. You just sent ripples through your kingdom that if somebody's family or friends with the king, they get special treatment. And if they're not family and friends, they don't get that special treatment. And if someone wants to point out your favoritism, you're going to be embarrassed and want to shut them up. It just happens. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so it's like a pull of a magnet, right? Like the law of gravity, like a pecking order. It's this human nature wants to concentrate power. I love the movie Lord of the Rings. There's a scene in there where the little Frodo offers the ring to Gandalf, and Gandalf says, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. And then Gandalf rebukes little Frodo when he offers him the ring. He says, don't tempt me, Frodo. I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe. Understand, Frodo, I would use this ring from a desire to do good, but through me it would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine. What's he talking about? Every now and then you get a good king, and he wants to concentrate power so he can do good more efficiently. But he doesn't live forever, and at some point he's going to hand that concentrated power over to some son or grandson that's a lousy ruler but likes his position and gets oppressive. What's the Bible example? Joseph in Egypt. A godly man concentrates power into the hands of the Pharaoh. And what did that particular Pharaoh do with the power? He fed the children of Israel, gave them the best land of Goshen, gave them jobs taking care of his cattle. But then there was a new Pharaoh that used all that concentrated power to oppress the children of Israel. Right? He did not know Joseph. And he made them slaves and even throw their sons in the Nile River. So that's the dilemma. Every now and then we get our guy in, and we sort of turn, and let him usurp power because he's pushing our agenda, but he's not in there forever. And when he's out, he turns all that over to the other party, and they use it oppressively to push their crazy agenda. So here's the verses I was talking about. So the devil taking Jesus up on a high mountain shows him all the kingdoms of the world. The devil said to him, all this authority I'll give to you, for this has been delivered to me, and I give it to whomever I wish. Therefore, if you'll worship before me, all will be yours. And of course, Adam was the one that gave the authority. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. And then Jesus says, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them. But ye shall not be so. He that is greatest among you, let him be as he that doth serve. I am among you as he that serveth. So Jesus is talking kingdoms here, and he's saying, my kingdom is different than the world's kingdom. The world's kingdom are top down, and Jesus' kingdom is bottom up, right? So in reading through ancient civilizations, I kept seeing some things repeating themselves. One was that people groups would transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture. Even the Bible has the story of Adam and Eve plucking the fruit off the tree, gathering, and then Cain was a tiller of the soil, agriculture. And so once people groups would move from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, they would need to know when to plant the crops. So they would have to keep track of the seasons. So they would have to keep track of the stars. And so they would build big, immovable structures to observe the stars. Stonehenge, ziggurats, pyramids, they would all be lined up with the stars and then somebody got to climb up this big structure, observe the stars, see that the seasons are about to change, and come down with this secret knowledge from heaven as to when to plant the barley, and when to plant the oats, and when to plant the flax. And this person began to claim that they were an intermediary between the heavens and these lowly, ignorant people down below. And this is where you begin to get these kings claiming that they were divinely appointed. And so Babylon and Assyria, they had king priests. And then Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be the son of the god Osiris. Roman emperors claimed to be divine, and the august means divine, and they would demand their image be worshipped. Chinese emperors ruled by claiming they had a mandate from heaven. Inca emperors claimed to be delegates of the sun god. Muslim caliphs claimed to be successors of the messenger of Allah. Indian Raja, the word Raja means king, they were a semi-divine caste of rulers. Japanese emperors were heavenly sovereigns. And then they Christianized it in Europe and called it the divine right of kings. God chose me to be the king, so whatever I want done, it must be what he wants because he put me here, so I can pretty well do anything I want. And if you're challenging me, you're challenging God, and I can kill you. And so this was the concept. The most common form of government is kings, and they claim to be divinely appointed. And it was Creator gives all the power to this one guy, and he dispenses it to these lowly people down below. That's the norm for human government. Here's Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. He was called the Sun King because his subjects were like planets that revolved around him every day. And he said, I am the state. Talk about an ego. And then one time they said, you can't do this, king, it's illegal. He says, it is legal because I wish it. It's like, oh, okay, the law is nothing more than the king's wishes, and he just happens to have a really powerful army to make you obey. Here's King James. Jamestown's named after him. He says, kings are God's lieutenants upon earth, sit upon God's throne. The king is the overlord of the whole land, master over every person, having power over the life and death of everyone. Can you begin to see why America's founders wanted to break away from this guy? Yeah. So we're back to this. The British Empire, most powerful empire the planet had ever seen. And kings have subjects who are subjected to their will. Democracies and republics have citizens. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-sovereign, co-ruler, co-king. You're a citizen of America. You are a co-king of America. Now, democracy, the word has two meanings. One is a general reference to popular government, and popular comes from the word population or populace, where the people rule themselves. And as it became in use with FDR and with Truman, contrasting America with freedom and liberty, believing in God, with the Nazis and the socialists and the communists who don't. And so there's a general definition of democracy. But as a functioning form of government, a pure democracy like Athens, everybody had to be at every meeting every day to talk about every issue. 6,000 citizens of Athens, and they would gather in the marketplace, the agora, every day. And if you did not keep up with what we're talking about today, you are called an idiotus. An idiot. What are we talking about today? Oh, you So democracies were limited as to how big they could grow, because logistically you had to travel there every day. So they were called city-states, because it could only be as large as a city, because you had to. Republics could get bigger, because a republic is where you take care of your family and your farm, and you have someone in your place that goes to the market every day. They are your representative. Easy to remember, REP in republic is basically REP in representative. A Republican form of government is a representative. You're still in charge. You're just delegating to somebody else to represent you. Whereas in a democracy, you personally are there. But either of those forms of government, the citizens are the king. And so it took centuries before America was given a chance to break away from a king and set up our republic. Here's James Wilson, a signer of the Declaration, Constitution, and put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibit to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they should live. So he uses the number 6,000, and he says something unique happened right here in America. Partly because we had a 3,000-mile ocean, and Europe was the chessboard that everybody was fighting over. And Daniel Webster, Secretary of State, said, miracles do not cluster. What has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. Now, why would there be anarchy throughout the world if the American Constitution fell? Because for 6,000 years, people have been suffering under the thumbs of pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and sultans and czars, and they thought, gee, if only we could rule ourselves without a king. Wouldn't that be wonderful? And in America, we did it. And if we blow it, there's nothing left for humanity to look forward to this side of heaven than what? Chinese dictators, Russian dictators, Iranian Ayatollah dictators. It's going to be a gang war on a global level, and human rights will be crushed. Now, so I like big picture stuff. So in looking at all these different governments, every government that's ever existed on planet Earth is somewhere on this line. One side of the line is total government, and the other side of the line is no government. They get sort of muddied with, oh, fascism and socialism and thisism and thatism and that. Yeah, it's either total government or no government. Total government, you have power concentrating into the hands of one person, and they rule through fear. The other side is no government, which would be anarchy. No government? Unless the people have morals and virtue. And so in reading through history, the first records show people wanted to limit the power of this king. The first way they limited the power of the king was through the king's own words. And it's in the Bible. The one king in Babylon wants to have a party, and he wants Vashti, the queen, to come out, and she won't. And he says, I'll never see her again. And later he feels bad and wants to see her. And his advisors say, King, I'm sorry, you can't see her again. You said you couldn't see her again, so you can't see her again. And then you have Darius. They trick him into saying, nobody can pray to anybody for 30 days but you. And then later they say, we caught Daniel praying to somebody else. You've got to throw him in the lion's den. And it says the king spent all day trying to get Daniel off the hook. But they said, King, you said it. You got to keep your word. And so he puts Daniel and said, Daniel, may your God be with you. But what's this all about? The king is limited by his own word. And there's even a little scriptural insight in there, right? Because God gives his word, and he promises to keep his word. So we can hold his word up to him and say, God, you said, right? And then kings are limited by past kings' words. And so all the past kings' words are piled together. They're called traditions and customs. And so what's an example? Cyrus lets the Jews go back and rebuild the temple. And then another king gets in office, and the locals make the Jews stop. And they send a letter to the current king saying, find out in the records. The previous king Cyrus said we could do this. And so they dig, and they find it. And the current king honors the past king's word. Right? So you begin to collect all this called traditions and customs, but they're limiting the current king. And then religion. So I mentioned how all of these pagan religions, they claim to be appointed by some of their pagan gods or whatever. So they needed a religious group to give them a rubber stamp. And the religious group could sort of play their cards, may or may not give you the rubber stamp. And so the kings would want to be, so remember when Pharaoh confiscated all the land in Egypt? He took all the land from everybody except the Egyptian priests, because he wanted them to like him, because he needed them to say, oh yes, he's the son of Osiris. And then when in Europe, religion limited the kings. The Pope would put the crown on their head and so forth, and they would remind the king that you're going to be held accountable to the ultimate judge, so you better judge fairly. So Montesquieu is contrasting the Christian kings of Europe with the Ottoman sultans, and he goes, the Ottoman sultans, they'll chop off heads and they'll give harems to, and everybody, but he says in Europe, these kings are limited by Christian morality, because the religion keeps saying, okay, king, you're going to be held accountable to the ultimate judge, so you better, but again, limiting the king. And then kings like to still be liked, so they're limited somewhat by public opinion. And then kings need taxes. And they let some princes and dukes and barons have some weapons to go out and extract the taxes from the people. And in return, they would let these guys have a castle. And so that's where you had England King John. His brother was King Richard that did the Third Crusade. Remember Robin Hood and King Richard the Lionheart? And anyway, Richard dies, and then John's back in as the king, and he's got his 25 barons, and they're collecting taxes. And if he doesn't like him, boom, gets rid of one, puts in another. And these barons are like, man, we're living on thin ice. He could get rid of us anytime. So these 25 barons surround King John on the fields of Runnymede. Hey, we want to have a little meeting, and so he shows up at the meeting, doesn't realize he's meeting with the 25 barons and all their armies. And they quickly shut off his way back into the castle. And he's sort of stuck. And they said, we want you to sign this document that says you can't pick on any one of us, and if you do, the other 24 will team up against you. And he's like, oh, I knew I shouldn't have come out today. Just had a bad feeling when I got... But again, limiting the power of a king. And then these barons would get together often, and they turned themselves into a parliament. House of Lords, House of Commons. And then they would limit the king through charters and constitutions and bills of rights and get him to agree to stuff. And then finally America comes along, and we say, let's just cut the umbilical cord. Let's just flat out not have a king. Let's make the people the king. All right? And so if we're not going to have a king who rules through fear, we need to have a population with internal morals. And so do I still have your attention? Is this interesting? Now, how did America come about? So let's jump into history. You have the Roman Empire persecuting Christians for 3 centuries, and then Constantine stops the persecution. And then you have Attila the Hun killing for another century, and all the Visigoths and Ostrogoths. But then the next big threat is Islam. So 622 AD. I wrote a whole book, but Muhammad was a religious leader. His dad died before he was born. His mother died when he's 6. His grandfather, guardian, dies. He's 8. He's taken in by an uncle, Abu Talib, who takes him on camel rides to different cities, hears about different religions, and he sort of pieces together stuff. So the Zoroastrians in Persia believe that paradise was filled full of virgins, and so he put that in there. And then there's some pagans, and they worship Hubal, the moon god, and they had this rock that they thought fell in from the moon, and so he included that in there. And then the Jews bowed toward Jerusalem, and so he, for 18 months, had his followers bowing toward Jerusalem, but when the Jews rejected him, he switched it to Mecca. And then even Encyclopedia Britannica says the gospel was made known to Muhammad through apocryphal and heretical sources. So he thought the Trinity was the Father, Mary, and Jesus. Right? Nobody explained to him the Holy Spirit. Anyway, he pieces all this together, and he thinks there's something in it for everyone. He goes into Mecca with his new religion, and they don't like it. And he only makes 70 converts in 12 years. He gets confrontational. They chase him out of town. And so he has nowhere to go. He's the first Muslim refugee. He goes to a city called Al-Taif. They don't want him. They pelt him with rocks and stones, and little kids chase him out of town. And so he goes to a Jewish city called Medina, and they let him in as a Muslim immigrant. And he goes into the minority neighborhoods and organizes a following, sort of like a community organizer. When his following gets big enough, he goes to the Jewish leaders in Medina and pressures them to accommodate him and his new followers politically. And so now Muhammad's a political leader. And when his followers back in Mecca get confrontational, they get chased out of town for disturbing the peace. He allows them to rob the caravans headed back to Mecca. And now he becomes a military leader. And he fights in 66 battles, killing 3,000 people. And so he transitions from a religious leader to a political leader to a military leader. And his followers conquer Yemen, which used to be a Jewish kingdom, down at the toe down there. And then they conquer Arabia, and then they conquer into the Holy Land. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine, and now it's conquered by Caliph Umar. And then Syria was completely Christian. Syria was the first country to be completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul, until Caliph Umar conquered it around 648. And then Egypt was completely Christian, evangelized by Mark that wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was Christian for 6 centuries until Amir ibn al-As conquers it. And then there used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century. Boom, conquered by the Umayyad Muslims. The Christians had embraced something called pietism. This is, if you're really Christian, you're not going to be involved, you're going to withdraw, and they would live as hermits in caves. They would give away all their money, And then they join a monastery, take vows of silence, and they even had the desert fathers where they would build a platform in the desert, climb on top, bake in the sun, thinking they're denying their flesh and getting holier. But it was this, my relationship with God, I'm going to withdraw. And as a result, Islam just swept through with no resistance, conquered all of North Africa, and in the year 711 they invaded Spain. The Spaniards were fighting on foot with heavy metal swords. Muslims were on Arabian horses with stirrups and scimitar swords. In 10 years, they conquered all of Spain. And then they conquered Greece. All 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation were conquered by the Muslim Turks. And anyway, and they invaded Rome, and they trashed the Basilica of St. Peter's, and they trashed the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul. It was after that that Pope Leo decided to build a 39-foot wall around the Basilica of St. Peter's. And then it says they invaded Rome, the Battle of Ostia, but then they were driven out. And so in 1071, the Turks begin to invade the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire begs the Catholic West for help. The West sends help. It's called the Crusades. And then finally, the Muslims conquered Constantinople in 1453, the biggest city in Europe. Today it's Istanbul. And when Constantinople falls to the Turks in 1453, it ends the land trade routes from Europe to India and China. And so that's when you have Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus looking for a sea route to get from Europe to India and China, right? In the 1200s, Marco Polo went from Venice, Italy to China. So everybody knew China was there. But now the Muslims conquered all that Central Asia area. And so Columbus looks for a sea route and runs into the New World. And he thought he was in India, so he named the people he met the what? Indians. Think of it. We never would have called Native Americans Indians had it not been for Islamic Jihad. Columbus gave him the name Indians because he thought he was in India. Why was Columbus trying to get to India in 1492? Because in 1453, the Muslims conquered the land routes to India. And so the Islamic Empire is ruled by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, and he is at the gates of Vienna. They enslave an estimated 1 to 2 million Europeans. There were whole Catholic orders in Europe called the Trinitarians, and the head of the order was called the ransomer, and they would try to ransom back your Christian friend that was captured from a Greek island or Italian coast. But Islam enslaved over 180 million Africans. And so you got the King of Spain. And he is the most powerful guy in the world. Controls Spain, lots of Italy, the Netherlands, the New World, and then the Philippines, and then through marriage, the blue areas, which is Portugal. And so in the 1500s, the 2 most powerful kings on planet Earth are the King of Spain and the Muslim Sultan. So we're drawing a line to where America came from. We're talking about how 6,000 years of history, the most common form of government's kings, and these kingdoms keep getting bigger and bigger because of military advancements, they can kill more people. The 1500s, the 2 most powerful kings on the planet is the Spanish King Charles V, the Muslim Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. In the middle of all that, the Reformation starts. Martin Luther, 1517. And he is held to a trial before the King of Spain. Right? So that's Charles V right there. He's 25 years old. And he calls it an argument among monks. And so you have a bunch of monks over here, and you got this one lone monk over here. And the king says, I'm going to go with the bunch. And Martin Luther is swept away and hidden in a castle, and there's sort of a trap door in the ceiling, and he's in this room where he translates the Bible into German. And meanwhile, the Muslim Sultan is still conquering. And in 1529, he surrounds Vienna, Austria. And Martin Luther says the fight against the Turks must begin with repentance. We must reform our lives or we shall fight in vain. Our sins have earned God's wrath, so he justly gives us into the hands of the devil and the Turk. What's he talking about? It's Deuteronomy 28. If a nation hearkens to the voice of the Lord, they'll be above and not beneath, head and not the tail. If they do not hearken to the voice of the Lord, it says all these diseases of Egypt will come upon them, but it also says the stranger will come in amongst you and rise up above you, and they'll be the head and you'll be the tail. And how did God judge ancient Israel when they sinned? He let the stranger come in, the Amalekite, Hittite, Moabite, termite, mosquitobite, parasite, all the ites, right? And then when they repented, he raised up a leader and drove them out. But so you got King of Spain. From his point of view, being Catholic, he has a double dilemma. Protestant Reformation on one side, Muslim invasion on the other side. So he's got this internal problem of this Reformation, but this external problem of the Sultan Suleiman attacking. He tries to stop both for decades and then realizes he needs the Protestants' help. And so in 1555, he passes the Peace of Augsburg, which is the first treaty ever to recognize Protestants. And I took some German in college. You know how to say 1555 in German? 5555. I think it sounds funny. Anyway, in this treaty is a little Latin phrase that had enormous repercussions. The phrase was, cuios regio eius religio, whose is the reign, his is the religion. In other words, look, Protestant king, believe whatever you want in your kingdom. I just need you to work together with me against this Islamic invasion because they sort of want to kill us all. And it worked. It stopped the Islamic invasion. But in the next century, different kings believed different things. And so it turned into one Christian denomination per country in Europe. What the king believed, the kingdom had to believe. And if you did not believe the way your particular king did, you were persecuted, you fled. And so northern Germany and Sweden were Lutheran. Switzerland, Calvinist. Scotland, Presbyterian. Holland, Dutch Reformed. Greece was Greek Orthodox, Russia was Russian Orthodox, Serbia was Serbian Orthodox, Romania was Romanian Orthodox, and then Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Italy, and Poland stayed Catholic. And then you had some people that didn't get their own country, like the Anabaptists and the Mennonites. They were following a Christian guy named Menno. And since they were being shoved out of every country, the Tsar of Russia said, come over here, we got some land for you. And they come over, and they didn't realize that the land was a buffer land between Russia and the Ottoman Turkish Empire. So they were involved in lots of wars. But these Mennonites worked really hard and became successful farmers until Lenin came along, and they were called kulaks, but they were the Mennonites, and Lenin had them killed. And that's when a lot of the Mennonites fled to America. But then you had England, and England was Anglican. So prior to the Islamic invasion, all of Western Europe was Catholic. Because the invasion was so severe and the Reformation starts, the king tries to stop both, can't, needs the help of these Protestants, lets them believe whatever they want, and now you got them believing all kinds of different things, but it's one Christian denomination per country in Europe. And so Europe is thrown into this mass migration of people shifting from one country to another simply for conscience sake. Prior to this, it was all Catholic, but now it's everybody's just, right? And those were the ones that spilled over and founded colonies in America. And every colony in America was started by a different Christian denomination. Virginia was Anglican. Massachusetts was Puritan. Rhode Island was Baptist. New York was Dutch Reformed. Delaware and New Jersey were originally Swedish Lutheran. And then Connecticut and New Hampshire were Congregationalist. Maryland Catholic, Pennsylvania Quaker. They didn't get along. They would tar and feather each other until they had to work together against the King of England, similar to the Catholics and Protestants working together against the Ottoman Sultan. Sort of interesting. The Lord wants us to be one, and there's an easy way and there's a hard way. Easy way, we just love each other and get along and forgive each other. If we don't decide to, he can let it get a little bit tough. And anyway, so let's focus in on England. I don't know if my battery might be going out, but Henry VIII was the King of England. And he originally was Catholic. And he was married to Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of the King of Spain. After 18 years, she does not have a son. a daughter Mary, but not a son. So Henry VIII decides to divorce her. And Mary, Anne Boleyn, a Protestant, and she said, I'm not going to be your mistress. If you want to marry me, you got to divorce her. And so Henry decides to do that, but the Pope won't recognize the divorce. And after trying, Henry said, you know what? I'm just going to make myself my own Pope and then grant myself permission to divorce her and to marry Anne Boleyn. And he does it, and he makes himself the head of the Anglican Church in England. It's a hierarchical church. The king, the Archbishop of Canterbury in York, and the bishops and deaneries and vicars and curates and rectors in it, right? And then he goes on to have 6 wives. He says, okay, since I'm my king and do whatever I want, right? So it's divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Henry VIII was not a really nice guy to be married to. Ended up being around 400 pounds. He would only eat meat. He thought vegetables were sissy food. Got gout in his leg, and anyway. So his advisors, when he was wanting to break from Rome, his advisors said, King, if you're serious about breaking from Rome, you need to stop using that Latin Bible. Get yourself an English Bible. The German princes have Martin Luther's German Bible. That helped them to break away from Rome. You need an English Bible. He says, fine, get me one. Well, it just so happens a few years earlier, Henry VIII had William Tyndale burnt at the stake for translating the Bible into English. And William Tyndale's last words were, Lord, ope the King of England's eyes. And so now the king suddenly wants an English Bible. So they take William Tyndale's work, polish it up, and they call it the Great Bible. Now, there were other scholarly translations, but this is the first one accessible by the common people. Henry VIII orders a copy of the Great Bible put in every church in England. It was nicknamed the Chained Bible because they chained it to the pulpit because it was so valuable. It was enormous, but people got to read it. Right? Your turn's up, it's my turn. And they would want to read it really fast, and then my turn, right? It's the first time the common people of England could read the Bible in their own English language. And so Henry dusts his hands and goes, that's it. We've broken from Rome, got our English Bible, we're set. But something unexpected happened. People actually began to read it. Began to compare what's in it to this king divorcing and beheading his wives and claiming to be the head of Christ's church on earth. And so a group starts that wants to purify the Church of England, and they are nicknamed the Puritans. The king doesn't think he needs any purifying. He thinks he's fine just the way he is, so he persecutes the Puritans. And so you got the Catholic Church, the king breaks away, and then you got the Anglicans, but then there's these Puritans. They're still part of the Church of England, but they're a little bit of a resistance group. But then there's a group that says it's beyond hope of purifying. We're going to separate ourselves. And they're called separatists, and we call them pilgrims. And anyway, so the Calvinist Puritans have this idea of setting up a government without a king. And you had kings. And I got some slides in one of my other presentations, but you have the breaking away from the Catholic Church, and now you have all these different kings, but it's still what the king believed the kingdom had to believe. And so the King of Spain, remember him? Charles V of Spain, fights the Muslims. He wins the big Battle of Lepanto in 1571. It's the biggest battle ever on the Mediterranean Sea. 230 Muslim ships powered by 1,500 Christian slaves roaming for them under the deck, fighting 200 of the Holy League ships led by Spain. And Spain wins. But rather than going around the Mediterranean freeing up all these countries from Islamic control, the King of Spain decides to crush the Reformation in the Netherlands and sends the Iron Duke of Alba to Antwerp, Holland in 1572, and they have thousands of Protestants killed, leave their bodies in the streets. And then the King of Spain, now it's Philip, he sends his armada in 1588 to crush the Reformation in England. And then you have the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici. and she arranges for her daughter, Margaret, to marry the #1 Protestant leader in France, Henry of Navarre. About 15% of France is Protestant. It's a big wedding in Paris. 2 days after the wedding, she has them pull the chains across the street so the carriages can't go out. And she sends her soldiers house to house, and they killed 30,000 Protestants, throw their bodies in the Seine River. And now, when I share this, I have to have a caveat. So we're not talking Catholics and Protestants, and one good, the other bad. There's Protestants that kill Protestants. There's Protestants that kill Catholics. I mean, when you go read through this history, you really can't say that some people are the right. I mean, it's like a confusing time, so I don't want to get into that. But you have the Queen of France, Catherine de' Medici, killing 30,000 of these Protestants, these Huguenots. And so in the French-speaking area of Switzerland, you have a guy named John Calvin. And so for most of world history, you have kings, and you have the interpretation of Romans 13. I shared this with some pastors earlier tonight, that says you have to submit to the government. Romans 13, all authority is set up by God. The authorities that exist are set up by God, right? And it's like, okay, we got good kings, we got bad kings, we just got to sort of submit to them, you know. But what if the king literally wants to kill your wife and kids? Are you supposed to say, okay, king, here they are, you just kill them? No. And so in the French-speaking area of Switzerland, John Calvin says, when a king disobeys God, they automatically abdicate their worldly power. He who does not make his reign subservient to the divine glory acts the part not of a king, but of a robber. We are subject to the men who rule over us, but subject only in the Lord. If they command anything against him, let us not pay the least regard to it. What he's referring to is similar in the Bible where it says, children, obey your parents. Yeah. But what if the parent tells the kid to kill the neighbor and sell themselves into prostitution and, rob and do drugs? Is the kid supposed to obey the parent and kill the neighbor? No. The kid obeys the parent as long as the parent's telling him to do something that lines up with God's word. He applies this to the king. We obey the king as long as the king's telling us to do something that lines up with God's word. And so the Calvinists, which in England were called Puritans, they began to study how to have a government without a king. And anyway, so these Calvinist Puritans were called Christian Hebraists because they studied the Bible, and they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. And they're fascinated with this period of history, the first 400 years out of Egypt before King Saul, and the Hebrew Republic period in history. So the kings of Europe, they looked to the Bible for their authority, but they looked to the King Saul and on period of the Bible, and the Calvinist Puritans looked to the Bible pre-King Saul. So King Saul is the dividing point between the kings of Europe and the bottom-up form of government we have in America. The founders of America, these colonial New England pastors, they look to the Bible, but they look to the pre-King Saul period where you have millions of Israelites and no king for 400 years, and it worked because everyone was taught the law. But the kings of Europe, they look to the anointed king of Saul and on period, right? Can you see that? Yeah. And so the king of England, his attitude was, yes, you can read the Bible in your own language. But no, you still can't believe whatever you want. You got to believe what I tell you to believe. I'm the king. So you do not make up prayers because you couldn't make up one that's wrong. So they wrote all the prayers down in a book, the Book of Common Prayer. You want to pray, just open it to the right page and read the prayer. And if you're caught with a group of people making up your own prayers, the FBI will kick in the door and handcuff you and drag you away to the Star Chamber, a government room where they would interrogate you, sort of like a January 6th hearing room, and they would twist your arm and get you to confess stuff you didn't do and brand you on the face as a heretic and cut your ear off. And then they passed the 5 Mile Act. If you're caught preaching within 5 miles of a town and you have not cleared it with the government, you're a criminal. You go to that Star Chamber. They passed the Conventicle Act in 1664. It comes from the word covenant. Jesus said, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there in the midst. And so in Scotland, they had a lot of these conventicles, small groups of people covenanting together. The king didn't like that, and so they would raid your group and arrest everyone. They later changed the name of that act to the Riot Act because you could be planning an insurrection in your little Bible study. And so you're having your Bible study, the police kick in the door, pull out a piece of paper and read the Riot Act, which says everyone must immediately disperse or we will put you in jail where you'll rot away. And somebody that was caught during this was John Bunyan. He was having a Bible study, didn't clear it with the government. They raid it. He yells out, better to be persecuted than be the persecutor. He spent 12 years wasting away in that January 6th prison. And that's when he wrote Pilgrim's Progress. And the king even outlawed coffee houses. Now we're getting serious. And so coffee came from Ethiopia, which was the one country in Africa to stay Christian. So the Muslims called the Christians in Ethiopia kafirs, which means infidels. So they called it the kafir bean or the infidel bean. And Muslims conquered in Europe. They're defeated at the Battle of Vienna, and they abandon their tents. Jan Sobieski goes into the tents and finds these bags of beans. They get a captured Muslim to show them how to cook it and make it into a drink. But they weren't sure if they should drink it because it was the Muslim's drink. So they took a cup of it to Pope Clement. He tasted it, said, this is too good to leave for the Muslims. Let's baptize it. And then coffee spread across Europe. So have you had your cup of infidel today? But it's okay to drink. Pope Clement said so. And so there were 3,000 coffee houses in London. And that's where they would gather to drink coffee, and that's where they would talk bad about the king. And he didn't want anybody meeting in small groups, not prayer groups and not coffee groups, and so he outlawed coffee houses. And so anyway, they had the Newgate prison in London, and the early Baptists were put in the Newgate prison. So the founders of the Baptist faith in England were John Smith, John Merton, Thomas Helwise, and here's a book, John Smith, Thomas Helwise, and the First Baptist Church in England, with fresh light upon the Pilgrim's Father Church. Now, why the Pilgrims? Because the Pilgrim Church branched off of John Smith's church. Now, this is not the John Smith with Pocahontas in Virginia. This is the John Smith Baptist in England. And so, John Merton, Baptist founder, arrested, put in the Newgate prison. They don't feed you in the prison. You have to have some friend that misses you and brings you food. And so he had a friend bring him a bottle of milk, but instead of a cork, it had a wad of paper. And when the guard wasn't around, he unfolded the paper, took a splinter, dipped it in the milk, wrote out his pamphlets. It dries, it's clear. He folds it, puts it in the empty bottle. The guard takes it, his friend takes it home, unfolds it, holds it above a candle, just high enough so the heat of the candle turns the milk brown. They could read what he wrote. They typeset his pamphlets and they print them, and the king's like, how is he getting it out of the cell, right? And so the early Baptists called it the milk of the word because he wrote it in milk. And so what did he write? No man ought to be persecuted for his religion. Another thing he wrote, the practices of Christ and his disciples teaches no such thing as compelling men by persecution and affliction to obey the gospel. And another Baptist founder, Thomas Helwise, dies in the Newgate prison, but he wrote this, the king is a mortal man and not God. Therefore, he hath no power over the mortal soul of his subjects to make laws and ordinances for them, to set spiritual lords over them. For men's religion to God is betwixt God and themselves. The king shall not answer for it, neither may the king be judged between God and men. And so a later Baptist in America, John Leland, friends with James Madison, friends with Thomas Jefferson, he spoke in the U.S. Capitol. They used to have church service in the U.S. Capitol. And John Leland said something very similar to Thomas Helwise. He says, every man must give account of himself to God, and therefore every man ought to be at liberty to serve God in a way he can best reconcile to his conscience. If the government can answer for individuals at the day of judgment, let men be controlled by it in religious matters. Otherwise, let men be free. In other words, if the government can stand there on the day of judgment and answer for why you believe whether or not you can kill the baby in the womb and whether marriage and how many sexes there are, right? If the government's going to be there, fine, just believe whatever the government tells you. But if the government is not going to be there on the day of judgment, you are accountable to God for your own conscience. Kings didn't like that. They want you to believe what they tell you to believe. And so Jefferson wrote to the Baptists, "Gentlemen, believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation on behalf of the rights of conscience." So Roger Williams, Baptist founder of Rhode Island, he said, "God requireth not a uniformity of religion to be enacted and enforced in any civil state. Enforced uniformity is the greatest occasion of civil war, ravishing of conscience, persecution of Christ Jesus and his servants. Persecution for the cause of conscience is most contrary to the doctrine of Christ Jesus, the Prince of Peace." And so Roger Williams founded this freedom of conscience. And there's his statue in Rhode Island. Talks about freedom of conscience, distress of conscience. And Roger Williams, devotion to his freedom of conscience. And he started the first Baptist church in America. And his statue is in the U.S. Capitol, Statuary Hall. Every state gets to pick 2 statues. Rhode Island has Roger Williams in the U.S. Capitol, right? He started the state. And but it's a congregational form of church government. Everybody's involved. And he writes this: "Jews under the Old Testament and Christians under the New Testament are both separate from the world, and that when they open the gap or hedge in the wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world, God hath ever broken down the wall, removed the candlestick, and made his garden a wilderness as it is this day." And the remove the candlestick is from the book of Revelation. It says, "Repent, return to your first works, or I'll remove your candlestick." And so Williams continues, "And that therefore, if he ever pleased to restore his garden or paradise, it must of necessity be walled in peculiarly under himself from the world, and that all that are to be saved out of the world are to be transplanted out of the wilderness of the world and added unto his church or garden, a separation of holy from unholy, penitent from unpenitent, godly from ungodly." What's he talking about? It's Isaiah 5. "My well-beloved that planted a vineyard, fenced it in, and then planted a choicest vine, looked that it should bring forth grapes, but it brought forth wild grapes." And then he says, "O inhabitants of Jerusalem, I pray, what should I do between me and my vineyard?" He says, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll take away the hedge. It'll be eaten up. I'll break down the wall. It shall be trodden down. For the vineyard is the house of Israel. He looked for judgment, found oppression." So here he is saying, okay, Baptists, we got a wall around our little garden, and we get to have church, right? But if Christians sin, God will let the enemy come in and tramp them, like the Amalekites, Hittites, Moabites, right? So if we sin, God will have the wall torn down, and he'll let the government come in and tell you when you can have church. And the government will tell you how often you can meet and how many people you can be in the church and how many people can sit together. And the government will tell you all how to have church if you sin. But if you repent, God will kick the government out of the church and rebuild the wall of separation between church and state. The wall of separation was to keep the world, the government, out of the church. And this is what the Baptists believe, and this is what Jefferson was saying, "I believe with you." And anyway... So William Penn was imprisoned in the Tower of London for 8 months, being a Quaker, and he says, "Force makes hypocrites, 'tis persuasion only that makes converts." And so this is what was going on in Europe that caused the Pilgrims to want to flee to America. And I'm going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll pick up with the Pilgrims, and we'll talk about how our form of government without a king came from the church. So do I turn it back over to Pastor Samuel, and I'll be at my book table.